Welcome everybody, thank you for coming. My name's Ruth Jarman, I live in Odium in Hampshire, and I'm a supporter of Just Stop Oil, and I'm a co-founder of a Christian group called Christian Climate Action that does direct action on the climate. For me, it's just something that I have to do as part of my peace of mind when I know how bad things are, to be able to respond in a way that is sort of truthful and honest. I would just highly recommend that you don't just leave here without committing to do something. And it doesn't have to be sitting on the road, gluing yourself to whatever. You know, that's one of the things you can do. But there's also, we need lots of supporters there's something like you need 10 supporters for each person that gets arrested, right? So, you know, we don't need everyone on the road, but if you want to help us in any way, there are lots of ways to help us. Leafleting, supporting people, donating. We need money to pay for things as well. So this is Maria. She's 23, a recent graduate, and now working as an energy consultant and living in Bristol. Her first experience of activism was with Extinction Rebellion in September 2021. So she's quite new to all this. She joined these groups after a turbulent relationship with climate change, months of anxiety and severe soft denial as she attempted to graduate university and start her career. So Maria realises that as someone born into privilege, it's a moral imperative for her to do all she can. Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks, Ruth. And thanks everyone for being here. It's amazing to see so many people. Do you want me to speak up?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. It's amazing to see everyone here today, so thank you for coming out this evening. As Ruth said, I'm Maria. I'm actually 24. I had a birthday since that was written. I've come here from Bristol today to speak to you about Just Stop Oil. So just to start with, Just Stop Oil's main demand is for the UK government to immediately halt all new licences and consents for the exploration, development and production of fossil fuels in the UK. And that's our goal. Now, what I'm going to speak about today is sort of split into two halves. Firstly, I'm going to talk about sort of the climate science, where we find ourselves now, and why Just Stop Oil sort of exists in the first place. And then the second half, I'm going to talk about what we want to do about the problems I've highlighted and how we want to achieve our goals, and why we think that's the best way to do it. So today, this evening, the main thing we're doing is we're telling the truth to each other and to ourselves. And it's really important that we acknowledge that truth. And we can't really talk about truth if we don't also talk about the absence of it. So perhaps denial. I'm sure everyone here has heard of climate denial. And we might think of it as those that are climate deniers or those that are not climate deniers. Us who get it and those who don't. The thing with climate denial is it's not a binary in that way that we think it might be. It's more of a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum we might get those really extreme climate deniers that we initially think of. Perhaps they might say climate change isn't real, it's just a hot day, you're all making it up, it's a big hoax, a conspiracy, whatever. A bit further along that spectrum, people might think, yeah, the climate is changing, but we've not got anything to do with it, it's natural cycles of the climate. And that's a type of denial as well. We come closer to the other end of the spectrum and we get people who say, yeah, climate change is real, and yeah, it probably is caused by human activities, burning of fuels, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. But we've got loads of time to figure it out, decades till it really affects us. We've got the technologies that will sort us out soon. That's also a kind of climate denial, because it's not really acknowledging the truth. And right at the other end of the spectrum is what we call soft denial. Ruth mentioned it just a minute ago. And soft denial is a phenomenon, basically, which everyone finds themselves experiencing. And soft denial is when we understand the dire situation we're in with respect to climate change, climate catastrophe, rather. And we understand how urgent it is for us to act and how we don't have decades of time to do anything about it. We understand all this and yet we still don't act like we understand it. And that's what we call soft denial. And the thing with soft denial is it's an extremely human response to something horrifying. Of course we can't always truly face something really terrible that's facing us. It's too scary, we'd be paralysed by fear. And that's fine. But the idea of this talk today is to, just for a few minutes, break out of that soft denial and try and really face what it is we're facing and engage with it emotionally. So if there's things that I say today that you've heard 100 times before, you might be very well acquainted with the facts, you might know everything about climate change and current situation that there is to know. It doesn't matter, because we're going to hear it again, and that's fine. And if we hear it again, and this time we really think about what that means, it's not an abstract number, it's not a statistic or a year or a percentage, it's an impact on people and on the world. So that's what I encourage you to try and do today. So, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, the house is on fire. It's used as an analogy for the situation we find ourselves in now. The earth is the house. And our earth is both metaphorically and literally on fire. Wildfires broke out in London this summer when we reached 40 degrees, record temperature, never before seen. The London Fire Brigade had its busiest day since the Blitz. In France, 25,000 people fled their homes this summer because of wildfires. More metaphorically, the Rhine dried up this summer, the river in Germany. Pakistan, a third of it is underwater and 33 million people are displaced. I could go on. This is where we're seeing ourselves now. Our house is on fire. But when your house is on fire, what do you do? If your house is on fire, what do? You put the fire out. You take the things you value most or the people you love, you get them out, perhaps you call the emergency services, and then you put the fire out as a matter of first priority. When your house is on fire, you don't scroll Instagram, check your emails, do the dishes. You don't have time for that, because you need to put the fire out. So why is it that we are here today, the world is on fire, and we're not behaving like it, we're not doing anything about it? That is what Just Stop Oil is here to do, to try and do something about it, behave in line with the emergency that we're facing. So the reason we behave like this, it's partly this soft denial phenomenon that I mentioned earlier. We can't always be thinking, oh my God, it's an emergency and everything's on fire. We still have to live our lives. That's certainly true. But there's also an element that kind of runs a bit deeper about, we think, if it's such a problem, surely people are going to be doing something about it. There's people sorting it out, right? Yes and no. There's a little bit of an issue there when it comes to those people, for example, our government. And I'll paint a picture of what I mean by that. I don't know if you've heard of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Lots of nods, okay. So, just for those who might not know, in 2015 there was a global summit, essentially, of countries, and they came together, and it was the first legally binding climate treaty. And essentially, the countries that attended this, they agreed that what we're going to do, we're going to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. That is the limit we're going to set for ourselves, and we're going to change all our policies and the way we operate to not go above this limit. And they said, okay, well, 1.5 degrees is what we want to achieve, but there's also this 2-degree limit, which is the absolute maximum, as a sort of extra level, just in case. Cool, right? We've set good targets. They're on it. Those people who are sorting it out, they're on it, right? There was a paper published in 2021 in The Conversation. It's an online forum for scientists and experts to discuss and share ideas. And in this paper, it was written by 3 of the world's leading scientists. Between them, they have 80 years of experience. They know what they're talking about, and they know lots of people in the field. And they found that at the time of the Paris Agreement, they couldn't find a single climate scientist who thought that limiting our heating to 1.5 degrees was possible. Not a single climate scientist thought that that target set at the Paris Agreement was possible. Meanwhile, 6 years later, at the COP26 summit, the tagline was "Keep 1.5 alive." We're still celebrating this as our sort of silver bullet. We're gonna solve it. We're gonna keep it below 1.5, and no one thought it was possible. In fact, many studies believe we're already locked in for 1.5, if not 2 degrees. One study says we're on less than 1% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of heating, and a less than 5% chance of staying below 2 degrees of heating. So this is where we're at. So we're looking like 2 degrees of heating. Well, the thing is, when we reach 2 degrees of heating, we encounter these things called tipping points. Tipping points are essentially sort of critical thresholds within the atmospheric system at which there are sort of self-perpetuating feedback loops that make the problem worse. So this is, for example, the melting of the permafrost. There is 2 times the amount of carbon stored in the permafrost than there is in the atmosphere. So once that starts to melt and release carbon, you can imagine how things just fall off the cliff and get worse and worse. And so this is why the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research said that if we reach 2 degrees of warming, we're likely to reach 3 degrees of warming, sort of as a given, because it doesn't operate linearly like we tend to imagine things to happen. It gets a bit warmer, it gets a bit warmer. It doesn't happen, it gets a bit warmer, and then it gets a lot warmer. So David King is the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government. He said last year that what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. We are in a very, very desperate situation. So last year he said we have 3 to 4 years to determine the future of humanity. That was last year. So now we have 2 to 3 years to determine the future of humanity. What does determine the future of humanity look like? That's a pretty huge statement. What does that mean? Well, according to Sir David Attenborough, I want to get the quote right, he says, "If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon." Again, quite huge, abstract concept. What does that look like? I'm going to paint you a picture with one final scientific paper. This paper is called "The Future of the Human Climate Niche," and it was published a few years ago, and when it was published, it sort of went viral, which is quite strange for a scientific paper because they're always so full of jargon and stuff, you know, normal people don't get excited by it, but this paper had such a bombshell discovery that, relatively at least, it was huge. The future of the human climate niche essentially refers to the part of our planet where humans can live and thrive. Now, it found that today we have around 1% of the Earth's land surface that has an annual average temperature of 29 degrees and above. So these are temperatures where it's too hot, really, for civilizations and human settlements to properly survive and thrive. It's too hot to grow crops properly. Livestock don't fare well there. So these are pockets of sort of sub-Saharan Africa, you can imagine. It's just people can't live there properly. That's 1% of the Earth's land surface. Okay. This paper found that when we reach 3 degrees of warming, this not so difficult thing to reach, when we reach 3 degrees of warming, that 1% of the Earth's land surface becomes 19% of the Earth's surface. A fifth of the Earth's surface is too hot for people to live on if we reach 3 degrees of warming, which is what we're on track to reach by 2100 based on current policy. That's huge swathes of Central and South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and it's where a projected 3.5 billion people will live, or a third of the projected population. 3.5 billion people will have to leave their homes because it's too hot for them to live there. I'm not even talking about sea level rise, extreme weather, tropical diseases spreading beyond the tropics. It's just heat. 3.5 billion people is an unfathomable number of people. So I'll break it down into something a little bit more, something we can understand a bit better. The Syrian civil war generated 6.7 million refugees. That was one of the biggest refugee crises in recent history. That's 0.2% of 3.5 billion. It's also around, the population of Scotland is around 6 million. So imagine everyone in Scotland has to pick up and leave their homes, find somewhere else to live, because it's too hot, times 500. Meanwhile, crops are failing. There's drought, there's flooding. When times are hard, we see that we sometimes lose the best parts of ourselves. In coronavirus, we saw people getting worried about supplies, hoarding pasta and toilet roll. The shelves were empty. And when we hoard food, the scarcity increases, obviously. And when things are scarce, what happens? Their price increases. It's not outrageous or exaggerating to say that with the climate crisis comes food shortages, and therefore only the richest of us will be able to afford to eat. In Bristol, we had a few months ago, a gentleman, he was an asylum seeker from Mali. He was being held in a travel lodge or something a few miles south of Bristol. And back home, he was a climate activist. He reached out to us to sort of join in the climate movement within Bristol. And so we got to speak to him and find out his story. He told us that, at least where he comes from in Mali, it hasn't really rained properly for 2 years. As a result, people there, they can't grow crops, they can't maintain their livestock, and people are desperate. And when people are desperate, it creates conditions that allows extremist groups to take more of a hold, because people will do anything for a livelihood. And he explained that where he's from, it's just collapsed and been given in to the extremist groups, the militia there. And it isn't an exaggeration to say that that is a result of the climate crisis. So the future we're looking at, if we don't change the course we're on, is a future of mass starvation, mass suffering, and mass death. And that's not a planet that I want to inherit, or I want the generations below me to inherit. It's not one that we deserve to inherit. We should not have to be dealing with that. So, we're facing probably the biggest crisis in human history. What do we do about it? Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN, and even the International Energy Agency, which was initially set up to protect oil and gas interests, have all said in no uncertain terms that there can be no new investments in fossil fuels. Liz Truss says that opening up new fossil fuel plants in the UK will help end our dependence on Russian oil and gas and will ease the cost of living crisis. And that is why there are 130 new oil and gas licences ready to be okayed in the UK. The problem is she is lying. Firstly, oil and gas is what funded Putin in the first place in his invasion of the Ukraine. They will not be part of the solution. Secondly, oil and gas projects take an average of up to 29 years to actually start producing oil and gas after licensing. And so they will not be helping families this winter to pay their energy bills. They will not bring our energy bills down. Anything that is extracted from these sites will be sold on global energy markets for maximum profit. So these things will not help struggling households this winter, and it will not help to stop funding wars. In fact, in 2019, there were 8,500 people who died in the UK because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. That was before the price increases. Can you imagine what we're going to look at this winter? Meanwhile, in the first quarter of this year, fossil fuel companies boasted record profits of tens of billions of pounds. So no, opening up new oil and gas fields are not the solution. All they will do is line the pockets of shareholders. What we should do instead is we should insulate our homes. We should subsidise in public transport and invest in clean, green transport. We need to invest in clean energy, new green jobs, retrain workers so that no one is left behind in this transition away from fossil fuels. And that's where Just Stop Oil's demand comes in. The demand that we ask the government to announce that it will immediately halt all new licensing and consents for the exploration, development and production of fossil fuels in the UK. 71% of carbon emissions since 1988 have come from fossil fuel companies. Meanwhile, they have lobbied governments, they have shifted the blame onto individuals, such as through terms such as personal carbon footprint, which is popularised by oil and gas companies, by pushing schemes such as recycling, which is, for all intents and purposes, pretty much a scam, and have even been implicated in the deaths of activists abroad. And that's not a controversial thing. They have been implicated in the murder of climate activists in the Niger Delta. And so what we need to do is to make them pay the repercussions. It's not up to us as individuals to pay for this transition. It's those with their billions of profit. And how are we going to bring this about? Well, we've been marching for decades, signing petitions, writing letters to MPs. Meanwhile, greenhouse gas emissions are still increasing, and they don't look like they're slowing down at all. Nothing is changing. So, what? We are going to do what it non-violently takes to bring about the drastic and radical change that we need to prevent climate catastrophe. And that is why Just Stop Oil is going to use civil disobedience to bring about our goals. And civil disobedience throughout history has been shown to work and bring about change. Despite being unpopular, it is effective at pressuring governments and changing public opinion. Just take some water. For example, in 1961, in America, the Civil Rights Movement, progress was being made, but it wasn't being made fast enough. So a group called the Freedom Riders, they were a group of just 13 black and white activists. They were students, and they wanted to challenge the Jim Crow laws of America at the time. So they got on a bus and sat together, which was illegal to do across state lines. And they kept sitting together on that bus as it travelled south through America. And they didn't stop at the first southern state where that was not allowed. They kept going down and down and down, right into the heart of the most brutally racist state, into Alabama. When they got there, they were met by an angry mob. The police stood back and allowed racist mobs to beat them. The doors were jammed shut and it was set on fire. Somehow, miraculously, they managed to escape the burning bus and they were met by more beatings and abuse. Meanwhile, the police continued to watch on until that was done, and then they were arrested and taken away. Those who were badly hurt, ambulance drivers refused to take them to hospital, even. But then, a few days later, a group of 24 students, another group, repeated that action, exactly the same, again, and they were met in exactly the same way. But they kept going back and back and back, because they couldn't afford to lose, they couldn't afford to live with these racist laws any longer, and they kept going until there were over 400 people incarcerated in American prisons for sitting on a bus. Until the government cracked, and no, they didn't solve racism, but they did make the government enact its policy of desegregating interstate travel on buses in America. And that might sound like a very small win, but what it did was it inspired other movements and it catalysed other movements, and it helped to really push the American civil rights movement along further. More recently, we can look at, for example, Extinction Rebellion in 2019. Roads were blocked in central London, and over 1,000 arrests were made for just sitting down. It was found that the majority of the British public disapproved of their actions, so they also were wildly unpopular. But what they did achieve was the UK Parliament declared a climate emergency. There was greater media coverage of the climate emergency on all platforms. And at the time, there was a poll which said 71% of people thought the climate emergency was more important than Brexit. In 2019, that's huge. But we can't stop there, because that's not the end of the goal. We've not solved climate change. That was amazing, but we need to go further. Insulate Britain last year, blocked roads, controversially, yes. They went from between 0 to 80% name recognition within 2 weeks of their actions. And now, as a result, insulation is being talked about in government as a key step in moving forwards in our energy strategy. Roger Harrobin, the BBC Environment reporter, said that the Insulate Britain campaign achieved more than he did in 30 years in just 3 weeks. This is how effective non-violent disruption and civil disobedience can be. And so that's what Just Stop Oil is planning to do. Continued non-violent civil disobedience and disruption until there is policy change. Because what we do as individuals is incredible and important, but in order to have the drastic changes that we need, at the scale and rate at which we need it, it needs to be on an institutional level. And the government is not going to do that unless we ask them to, unless we make them. So, Just Stop Oil, if you'd like to join in, there are 5 key ways really of getting involved. Firstly, just support us in your heart. Tell your mate, they're all right. That's amazing. Hearts and minds is where it's at. Secondly, you can help with giving a regular donation. That helps fund the actions, it helps fund talks like these. There's so many hidden costs to running a campaign, but particularly it's the actions and ensuring that people get to where they need to be, and also paying any fines that might be given to activists in court. Thirdly, you can get involved with putting on talks like these, speaking, delivering leaflets, sharing it on Facebook to get the word out far and wide. Fourth, you can be a support role. As Ruth mentioned, there's multiple people behind every single one person that takes action, and that looks like so many things. I know of one person who's a cat sitter for someone who wants to take action. Fantastically important role. Or it could be picking people up from the police station, driving people to their accommodation the night before an action. The list goes on. Or what you can do is come take part in a non-violence training day and choose whether you'd like to take part in action on the road. And we encourage everyone, actually, we ensure everyone comes to a non-violence training day before they take any action, because these training days not only help us to understand the concept of non-violence and to be prepared for actions and what might come our way, but it also helps people to make their mind up properly about whether it's something they might like to do, and to meet the people they might end up taking action with later. So yeah, globally our emissions are still rising, and we are moving closer and closer to climate catastrophe. We know there's no future left in fossil fuels, so we need to force the change and avert this catastrophe. Thank you. And one quote from Bill McKibben, which I think sums up everything I wanted to say really, really beautifully. It took me a long time to realise that the scientists had won the argument, but were going to lose the fight. Because it isn't about data and science, it's about power. The most powerful industry is fossil fuels, because it's the richest. At a certain point, it became clear that our only hope of matching that money was with currencies of movement. Passion, spirit, creativity, and warm bodies.
Thank you, Maria. Gosh, lots to think about there. Why am I part of Just Stop Oil? 3 reasons really. I'm a scientist. I first heard about climate change nearly 40 years ago when I was reading chemistry at university, and I thought then somebody would sort it out 40 years ago. I'm also a Christian, and I've always been to church and I've always cared about the environment, but there was a particular moment in my life when I was just walking down the street and the first verse of the Bible just hit me. Anyone know what the first verse of the Bible is? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And I thought, gosh, I've been a Christian all my life, and what does God think if we're trashing it? What does God think? You know, how can, in fact, if you go to church, every Sunday they say, I believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth. You know, how can they say that? How can we just say that every Sunday and carry on our lives as we do, you know? And then I became a mother, and I first heard about the tipping points that Maria talked about when I was pregnant with my first child. I did go on to have more. That's soft denial, I reckon. But tipping points, yeah, that beyond a certain point there will be nothing we can do. And yeah, it was that really fired me. So it's the mother bear in me, really, that got me. Basically, I used to leave my kids watching TV while I campaigned on climate change. You know, I neglected my family, basically, because my being a mother and being an ethical, religious person was dealing with this problem, right? So I would, all my MPs that I've ever lived near have seen too much of me, you know, and I've tried to get the community involved. I started a community solar scheme. We got solar panels on everyone. I fought with my family over the heating, you know, and holidays, and I expect some of you might know what that's like, I don't know. You just threw yourself into doing everything. And yet, as Antonio Guterres has said, climate change is moving faster than we are. You know, I've spent 20 years of my life campaigning, getting nowhere. And there's also something about doing something that is commensurate with the seriousness of the problem. We're talking about the decimation of life on Earth. We're talking about the possible extinction of humanity, right? And then you write to your MP as if a billion lives were a pothole in the road. You know, it's just there's not that. What can we do that's commensurate with the seriousness of the situation? And so I decided I would try and do some direct action on this, because that seemed to me to be the right thing to do, like Rosemary mentioned, the right thing to do. And also, it's a Christian thing, but it's also an ethical thing, that it's right to resist evil. It's right to resist evil. And if the creation of the maintaining of a system that destroys life on Earth isn't evil, I don't know what is. So that's why sitting in a road is the right thing to do at this time. And the peace that you feel when you have campaigned on climate change for as long as I have and got nowhere, you feel a sense of peace when you're sitting in that road and when you're sitting in the police station. There's nothing more you can do, right? I mean, just recently I was involved with the sitting in. I think it was probably similar to what. No, she was in Essex. No, this was the Kingsbury Oil Depot. We decided a load of us would sit at the entrance to the Kingsbury Oil Depot, and refuse to move. And there was an injunction on it, so it was an immediately imprisonable offence, and we knew that. And we decided the 51 of us would sit there. And just, it's a matter of telling the truth. This is that serious. I'm prepared to go to prison for it. It's that serious. And yes, and so then again, you know, getting Henry Thoreau, is that? He said that the only right place for a moral person in a corrupt society is in prison. You know, his mate went to visit him and he said, "Why are you in prison?" And he said, "Why aren't you in prison?" So there's something about it. Even though it seems crazy, I'm from a very sort of, I mean, this is such a lovely village, it looks a bit similar to town, it looks similar to the village where I live. I mean, my neighbours just wouldn't understand it, I don't think, but there is something right about this. Once you've seen how crazy this system is, just to be standing up against it is the right thing to do. So that's why I'm here.